Before Alabama was a state, it was a whisper. A sacred name, spoken by native tongues, etched into riverbanks, and passed through centuries of colonization, conflict, and survival. But have you ever wondered, what does Alabama really mean? And who said it first? Most of us know Alabama as a southern state rich in culture, music, and civil rights history. But the story of its name is far older and far deeper than most realize. Long before American flags flew over its soil, and even before French and Spanish explorers mapped its rivers, the name, Alabama, belonged to a people, to a way of life, to an ancient connection with the land. In this video, we'll peel back the layers of history to reveal the true, untold origin of Alabama's name, from its indigenous roots to its colonial reinvention and eventual statehood. 1. Native American roots of Alabama's name. When you hear the name, Alabama, what comes to mind? Perhaps it's the soulful echo of Southern blues, the rolling hills of the countryside, or the rich tapestry of American civil rights history. But hidden deep beneath these cultural layers is a name that tells a story older than the state itself, a name born from the earth, rivers, and people who walked the land long before it was ever part of the United States. That story begins with the Alibamu, a Native American people whose legacy still lives in the syllables we speak today. The origins of Alabama are firmly rooted in Native American heritage, specifically the Alibamu tribe, a subgroup of the Muskogee, or Creek, Nation. These indigenous people lived primarily along the Alabama River, one of the most vital waterways in the southeastern United States. For centuries, the river was their lifeblood, a source of food, transportation, trade, and spirituality. The people who lived there were not just survivors but skilled agriculturalists, hunters, and traders who thrived in harmony with the land. The name, Alabama, wasn't just plucked from the air, it's the echo of an identity that was once vibrant and alive across the river valleys and pine forests of the Deep South. The Alibamu, along with related tribes like the Kasati, were among the many indigenous nations that made up the vast southeastern tribal confederacies. These communities were not isolated. They traded goods, shared cultural traditions, and forged alliances across what is now the southern United States. Their language, traditions, and even the structure of their governance influenced later colonial and American systems. So how did the name of a tribe become the name of an entire state? As European explorers, first Spanish, then French, and later English, moved deeper into the continent, they began documenting the names of indigenous peoples and places, often phonetically recording what they heard without a clear understanding of the native languages. For the Alibamu, these records would become a permanent historical footprint. Spanish documents from the 16th century referred to them as Alibamu, and later French traders and settlers who arrived in the 17th and 18th centuries further adapted the name to Alabama. These early European interpretations, filtered through the lens of colonization, weren't always accurate, but they were enduring. Over time, Alabama became attached not just to the people but to the river, the surrounding territory, and eventually, the state itself. But even as the name was adopted, the Alibamu people were being pushed from their ancestral lands, victims of expanding European settlements and, later, American policies like the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Many were forcibly relocated to what is now Oklahoma during the Trail of Tears, a journey marked by suffering, death, and displacement. Yet the name remained. Today, when we say Alabama, we are unknowingly speaking the name of a people whose history predates the founding of the United States by centuries. Their influence is etched into the land, not just in the rivers and forests, but in the spirit of a place that has always been more than its borders. Though many descendants of the Muskogee and Alibamu live far from their original homeland, their cultural legacy continues through language revitalization efforts, oral histories, and tribal communities that still honor their ancestors' stories. Understanding the Native American roots of Alabama's name is more than a linguistic journey. It's a recognition of an erased past and a call to remember. It is a tribute to the resilience of indigenous peoples who gave names to the rivers and mountains long before we mapped them, and to whose stories we are all now connected, whether we realize it or not. 2. The meaning of Alabama. At first glance, Alabama may sound like just another melodic state name in the American South. But behind its rhythm lies a rich and nuanced meaning, one that offers a glimpse into how the indigenous people of this land understood themselves, their environment, and their way of life. While the exact translation remains debated among historians and linguists, the most widely accepted interpretation traces the word back to the Choctaw language, revealing a poetic and purposeful expression of identity. Plant gatherers, or vegetation clearers. But to understand why this matters, we need to dig deeper into the soil of language, culture, and survival. A word with roots, the name Alibamu, is believed to derive from two Choctaw words, alba, meaning vegetation or plants, and amo, meaning to gather, to clear, or to harvest. When combined, these words offer a powerful clue into how the original Alibamu people interacted with their environment. They were not just passive inhabitants of the land, they were active stewards. Their very name speaks to a deep relationship with the earth, one built on harvesting, managing, and sustaining natural resources. In many indigenous cultures, names are not arbitrary. They are chosen based on traits, behaviors, or spiritual meanings. If the Alibamu were referred to as those who gather vegetation, it likely points to a key element of their lifestyle. In this context, the name doesn't just describe what they did. It tells us how they survived, how they thrived, and what they valued. Agriculture and environment. The southeastern tribes, including the Alibamu, were known for their sophisticated agricultural systems. They cultivated crops like maize, corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers, the three sisters of Native American farming. But gathering wild plants was equally important. The forests and riverbanks of the region were rich in medicinal herbs, roots, berries, and edible greens. To clear vegetation didn't necessarily mean destruction. Instead, it referred to land management, a kind of early ecological science. The Alibamu would burn underbrush, prune trees, and rotate crops to preserve soil fertility. This wasn't just gathering, it was sustainable stewardship, and their name may very well reflect this vital role. Lost in translation? Despite its poetic nature, the meaning of Alibamu isn't universally agreed upon. Language barriers, historical erasure, and the oral nature of many Native American traditions have made it difficult for scholars to pin down one definitive translation. Some early European explorers misheard or misunderstood the words, writing down what they thought they heard in Spanish, French, or English phonetics. Over time, these different spellings and pronunciations added layers of confusion. However, the Choctaw interpretation remains the most credible because of its linguistic structure and the geographic proximity of the Choctaw and Alibamu peoples. The Choctaw and Muskogee languages share a number of features, and both tribes lived in close contact for centuries, likely influencing one another's languages and cultural expressions. A name that holds a mirror. What makes the name Alibamu so remarkable is that it provides more than a label. It tells a story of identity. It invites us to look at the past not through the eyes of colonizers and mapmakers, but through the lens of the people who lived off the land with care, wisdom, and intention. This simple name, so familiar to Americans today, embodies a way of life that respected balance with nature. It honors a community that understood the cycles of growth and harvest long before modern science put them into textbooks. In that sense, Alibamu is more than just a nod to indigenous roots. It is a linguistic time capsule, capturing an ancient worldview in just a few syllables. Why it still matters. In an era where climate change and sustainability dominate global conversations, the name Alibamu reminds us of something profound. Indigenous communities were practicing ecological balance long before the term environmentalist existed. Their name captured that relationship in real time. To gather plants was not just a daily task, it was a philosophy of respect, resilience, and reciprocity. So the next time someone says, Alibamu, they're not just naming a place. They're unknowingly speaking a piece of native wisdom, an echo of a people who understood that to thrive, one must live in harmony with the land. 3. Spanish and French influence on the name Alibamu. The word Alibamu may have been born from the tongues of indigenous peoples, but its survival into the modern age owes much to the European empires that once crisscrossed the American South. Long before Alabama became the 22nd state in the Union, its lands were visited, mapped, fought over, and recorded by Spanish conquistadors and French colonial explorers, each of whom played a pivotal role in shaping how we now recognize and pronounce its name. Their influence isn't just a linguistic footnote, it's a window into the collision of cultures that defined an entire era of North American history. The Age of First Contact. The Spanish were among the first Europeans to explore what would eventually be called Alabama. In the early 1540s, Hernando de Soto led a brutal expedition through the southeast, encountering dozens of indigenous tribes, including ancestors of the Alibamu people. Spanish scribes traveling with him recorded tribal names phonetically, often making guesses based on what they heard, filtered through their own language's sounds and rules. In Spanish records, the tribe's name was often transcribed as Alibamu or Alibamu. These early renditions were imprecise, but they preserved the essence of the original name. Even then, the act of writing it down gave it a kind of permanence in the European imagination. These records formed the first foundation upon which later colonial powers would build. The French arrive, mapping a name. A century later, French explorers and settlers entered the Gulf Coast region with a more organized colonial agenda. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, France had laid claim to vast territories stretching from the Great Lakes down to Louisiana, a domain known as La Louisiane. The area that would become Alabama was considered part of this expansive colonial empire. The French were not just explorers but cartographers, traders, and missionaries. They were meticulous in their efforts to document and name the lands they encountered. During their travels, they adopted the name they had heard from the indigenous peoples and the Spanish, Alibamu, and began spelling it Alabama in written records and on maps. This version of the name, refined through French orthography, is the one that ultimately became standardized. French influence was particularly strong in the region around Mobile, which served as the capital of French Louisiana before the capital was moved to New Orleans. French missionaries interacted with native groups like the Alibamu and wrote extensively about their languages, customs, and settlements. In doing so, they played a major role in cementing tribal names like Alabama into the written history of North America. Colonial tug of war. The competition between European powers for control of the Southeast meant that the indigenous names of places were constantly being reinterpreted, renamed, or repurposed. After the French lost control of the region to the British following the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the name Alabama remained on maps and in colonial records. By the time the United States acquired the territory, the name was so widely used that it transitioned smoothly into official American usage. Thus, while the word Alabama originated in indigenous culture, it was shaped and preserved through a century of colonial contact. Without the Spanish scribes and French mapmakers, the name might have been lost to time, just one of many unrecorded tribal identities that vanished in the tidal wave of colonization. More than a name, a legacy of collision. The European recording of Alabama is more than an academic curiosity. It's a living symbol of how cultures collide, intertwine, and influence each other in unexpected ways. It's also a stark reminder of the power dynamics that often decide which names survive and which are forgotten. European colonizers didn't just bring weapons and religion, they brought pens, maps, and alphabets. And with those tools, they captured fragments of Native American identity, sometimes accurately, often imperfectly. In this sense, Alabama stands at the crossroads of memory and erasure. The indigenous people who gave the state its name were eventually displaced, many of them removed westward in the 19th century. Yet the name remained, woven into the landscape, highways, government documents, and songs. Ironically, even as the people were forced out, their name became immortalized by the very structures that displaced them. Conclusion. A name preserved by empires. The influence of Spanish and French explorers on the name, Alabama, is a crucial chapter in its history. While their presence often brought violence and upheaval, it also resulted in the preservation of indigenous place names that might otherwise have vanished. Through centuries of translation, mispronunciation, and adaptation, the name endured, carrying with it the echoes of native voices, the scribbles of colonial chroniclers, and the enduring resilience of a culture that refused to be forgotten. 4. The first documented use of Alabama in European records. Long before Alabama was a state, before it was a territory or even a clearly defined land on a European map, it existed in the minds and mouths of the people who lived there for centuries, the indigenous Alibamu tribe. But when did Alabama first make the leap from oral tradition to the written word? When did it first appear in the dusty pages of European exploration logs, maps, and colonial documents? This is the story of how a word rooted in indigenous identity began its journey into recorded history, how it survived the scribes of Spanish explorers, the pens of French missionaries, and the ink of cartographers to eventually become the name of a U.S. state. The first documented uses of Alabama reveal not only how the word was preserved but also how historical power and cultural encounters shaped what names would survive into the future. The Spanish Chronicles. The first brush with the name. The earliest possible reference to the Alibamu people, and by extension, the name Alabama, dates back to the mid-16th century, when the infamous Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto led his expedition through the American Southeast. In 1540, de Soto and his men clashed with various indigenous groups across what is now Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. While the name Alabama wasn't written exactly as we see it today, historians believe that the tribal identities and place names mentioned in the chronicles of that expedition are early phonetic renditions of what would evolve into Alabama. Spanish records mention native groups such as Alibamu or Limamu, believed to be attempts to capture the sound of the indigenous names spoken by the local tribes. These records were notoriously inconsistent. Explorers wrote down what they heard, filtered through unfamiliar ears, thick accents, and the limitations of European alphabets trying to grasp the sounds of Muskogean languages. Despite these flaws, these early notations are critical because they are the first evidence that Europeans were encountering a distinct people whose name would later be preserved. French refinement and cartographic permanence. It wasn't until the late 17th and early 18th centuries that the name Alabama began to appear more frequently and more clearly in official documents. By this time, French colonists were firmly entrenched in the Gulf Coast, and they began producing detailed maps and journals of their exploration into the interior lands of Louisiane. In these French accounts, we see the spelling Alabama, or close variants like Alibamu and Alibamu, used more consistently. French explorers, Jesuit missionaries, and military leaders often referred to a group of people living near the river that today bears the state's name. These people, the Alibamu, had established themselves along the waterway, and their identity was increasingly tied to the land itself. French cartographers began labeling the area as Alabama on maps, fixing the name into European consciousness. This was an important step, because once a name appeared on a map, it had a claim to existence and permanence in the colonial world. These maps would be distributed, copied, and referenced by other European powers, ensuring the spread of the term. The 18th century. From tribal name to geographic identity. By the 1700s, the name Alabama wasn't just referring to a people, it had become associated with a river and a region. The Alabama River, one of the most important waterways in the southern United States, was named after the tribe, further cementing the connection between people and place. This shift, from tribal identity to geographic label, is significant. It reflects the broader pattern of colonization, where European powers often used indigenous names to chart unfamiliar lands, even as they displaced the very people who gave those names meaning. The name solidifies with American expansion. Following the French and Indian War, the British took control of former French territories, including present-day Alabama. By then, Alabama had become the commonly used name for the region, carried over into British and, later, American records. When the Mississippi Territory was divided in the early 1800s, and the eastern portion was organized into a new territory, the name Alabama was chosen, almost as if it had been waiting in the margins of maps for its chance to step into the spotlight. When Alabama became the 22nd state in 1819, the name had already existed for more than 250 years in European records, gradually evolving from a tribal reference to a territorial identity. That transformation didn't happen overnight, but through layers of interaction, misinterpretation, preservation, and colonial expansion. A legacy in ink. The first documented uses of the name, Alabama, tell a quiet but profound story. They show us how names can travel, carried by explorers, trapped in maps, misunderstood by foreigners, and yet still endure. They reveal how language becomes legacy, and how even in the hands of those who didn't fully understand it, a word can survive across centuries and cultures. The next time you see the name, Alabama, on a road sign, in a headline, or on a license plate, remember, it's not just a name. It's the echo of a people who once gathered plants by the riverbanks, the scribble of a Spanish priest in a tattered journal, and the label on a French map that helped shape the modern world. 5. Statehood and the legacy of the name, Alabama. When Alabama officially became the 22nd state of the United States on December 14, 1819, the name it bore had already carried centuries of history, etched into maps by European empires, spoken by native tongues, and shaped by cultural collisions. But its story didn't end with a declaration of statehood. Instead, Alabama's name entered a new phase of identity, not just as a geographic marker, but as a lasting symbol of a complicated past, a reminder of the indigenous roots that quietly echo beneath the foundations of the American South. From territory to statehood. The early 1800s were a transformative period in American history. The Louisiana Purchase had opened vast new territories to settlement, and pressure was growing to organize new states. The region that would become Alabama had long been part of the Mississippi Territory, but as settlers poured in and the population grew, often at the expense of indigenous communities, a new political boundary was drawn. In 1817, Mississippi achieved statehood, and the eastern portion of the territory was designated as the Alabama Territory. Just 2 years later, Alabama entered the Union as a full-fledged state. But its name, already well known thanks to decades of French and British records, was not newly invented or chosen by politicians. It had been inherited, passed down from indigenous heritage, preserved by European explorers, and now formally enshrined in the American political system. The legacy of a native name. That moment of statehood marked more than just a political milestone, it was a cultural one, too. In naming the new state, Alabama, the U.S. was unknowingly honoring a people it had long marginalized. The Alibamu tribe, whose name described their way of life as vegetation gatherers, or plant clearers, had already been subjected to decades of displacement. As white settlers flooded into the fertile lands of the Southeast, indigenous tribes faced mounting pressure, violence, and forced removals. Just 2 decades after statehood, Alabama would become a focal point of one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Thousands of Native Americans, including members of the Muskogee, Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations, were violently uprooted from their ancestral lands and forced to march westward along the Trail of Tears. The land that bore their names, and their memories, was taken, even as their language lived on in its geography. So while the name, Alabama, was celebrated as a proud symbol of statehood, it also became a symbol of paradox, an indigenous name etched into a landscape from which indigenous people were being erased. A name that endures. And yet, through all of this upheaval, the name survived. It appeared on everything. In schoolbooks, on flags, in postal routes, in court documents, on battle maps during the Civil War, and in the lyrics of songs that would come to define Southern culture. The word, Alabama, became more than a state name, it became an identity for millions who would never know its origin. But the truth remained, waiting to be uncovered by historians, linguists, and curious citizens willing to ask the question, where did this name come from? Reclaiming the story. In recent years, there has been a growing effort to recognize and honor the indigenous roots of American place names. In Alabama, that means acknowledging not just the name itself, but the people behind it, the Alibamu, the Muskogee, and the many other southeastern tribes who once called the region home. Schools, museums, and cultural institutions are beginning to revisit these stories, weaving them back into the broader narrative of the state. There is a growing awareness that to say, Alabama, is to speak a word of heritage, ecology, and resilience, even if most people don't realize it. A lasting symbol. Ultimately, the name, Alabama, stands as a testament to endurance. It survived linguistic translation, colonial upheaval, and cultural displacement. It lived on through war, migration, and transformation. And today, It serves as a subtle but powerful reminder that beneath the modern grid of highways and cities lies a story as old as the land itself, a story told not just in textbooks, but in syllables. So when we say, Alabama, we're not just invoking a place on a map. We're repeating the legacy of a people, the rhythm of a culture, and the enduring memory of those who lived in harmony with the land long before state lines were drawn. The next time you hear the word, Alabama, don't just think of a place. Think of a people. Think of resilience. Think of a name that endured across centuries, not because it was powerful, but because it was remembered. Names are more than words, they are memories carved into the soul of a nation. And this one, Alabama, still echoes with the voices of those who came before us.